It was an ordinary Tuesday, the kind where the mundane routines of life take precedence over anything out of the ordinary. I had just left my apartment building and was heading to the elevator, eager to get on with my errands. I had no idea that this seemingly simple day would soon take a turn into an unsettling and surreal experience that would stay with me forever. The man who stood next to me in the elevator, the one I had waved hello to 1,000 times before in passing, would soon become a central figure in a frightening episode. I had lived in the building for about a year and, like many urban dwellers, I had little interest in getting too close to my neighbors. My neighbor, Mr. Harrison, was one of those people who you could easily overlook. He was in his mid-50s, with a reserved, almost detached demeanor. His hair was graying at the temples, and his clothes were always neat but not particularly stylish. On the surface, there was nothing unusual about him. He was just another person in a sea of countless faces. There had been nothing particularly alarming about him, and in fact, I'd never given him a second thought. He was the type of person who kept to himself, spoke in polite but short sentences, and rarely made small talk. We exchanged pleasantries when we crossed paths in the lobby or elevator, but nothing more. I never knew much about his life, and frankly, I didn't mind. People had their own worlds, and mine was busy enough. But that morning, as I stepped into the elevator on the way to the ground floor, I noticed Mr. Harrison was standing right beside me, looking as though he was headed in the same direction. I pressed the button for the lobby, and the doors slid shut with a soft hum. The elevator began its descent. The low mechanical whir of the elevator made me feel slightly claustrophobic, but the familiar surroundings gave me a sense of comfort. It was nothing out of the ordinary. The silence between Mr. Harrison and me stretched on longer than usual. There was an odd tension in the air, one I couldn't quite place. And then, suddenly, the elevator jolted to a stop. It wasn't the usual smooth descent to the ground floor. This felt wrong. I felt my stomach drop in that strange way you do when you realize something unexpected is happening. The soft buzzing sound that usually accompanied the elevator's motion was replaced by a disturbing silence. The lights flickered once, twice, and then held steady. I looked at the buttons. None of them were lighting up. Panic began to stir in my chest. "Is the power out?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Harrison, standing a few feet away, didn't respond immediately. He seemed unusually calm, too calm. I glanced over at him, trying to gauge whether he was as concerned as I was. But his expression was unreadable. There was something in the way he was standing, so still, that made me uneasy. I pressed the emergency button, but the elevator remained stubbornly still. A moment passed, and then I heard Mr. Harrison speak for the first time since we'd entered. "Don't worry," he said, his voice steady. "This happens sometimes. The building's old. It'll start moving again soon." His words didn't reassure me. They felt flat, too rehearsed, as if he was saying something to calm me down. But there was no genuine emotion behind them. I frowned, my unease growing. It wasn't just the elevator being stuck that was bothering me. It was the way he said it, the way he sounded. There was something off about his calmness. "Are you sure?" I asked, my hands now gripping the railing on the side of the elevator. I could feel my pulse quicken. He nodded, but didn't look at me. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the corner of the elevator, somewhere near the ceiling. I was starting to feel trapped, not just in the elevator, but in the atmosphere. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It had to be a power surge or a glitch. But as the seconds ticked by, something told me it wasn't as simple as that. Time seemed to stretch. A minute, maybe two, passed in suffocating silence. The air inside the elevator was warm now, heavier. My thoughts began to race as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Why was Mr. Harrison so calm? Why was he not reacting like a normal person would? "I'm sure it's fine," he repeated. "We'll be out soon." His words were growing more insistent, as though trying to convince both me and himself. But the way he said it was unsettling. There was no panic, no real urgency. It was as though he was in no hurry to leave the elevator at all. I pressed the emergency button again, but the elevator remained motionless. A sense of unease crawled up my spine as I realized that we weren't simply stuck in a broken elevator, we were being trapped. I felt a cold knot of dread form in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't an accident. There was no way this was a coincidence. Something about this entire situation felt deliberately orchestrated, as though it was all part of a plan. For the first time, I noticed the subtle change in his posture. He had positioned himself so that there was little space between us. His presence, once unremarkable, was now oppressive. I shifted uneasily, trying to put distance between us, but the elevator's small size made that difficult. "And what? Why are we really stuck? And what?" I asked again, this time my voice more firm, demanding an answer. Mr. Harrison turned to face me, his eyes locking onto mine. The expression in his gaze sent a chill running through my body. Something in his eyes had changed. He wasn't the quiet, harmless neighbor I thought he was. There was something darker behind his gaze now, something that made my blood run cold. "Because I wanted to talk," he said softly. His voice had a strange, unsettling calmness to it, as though he had been waiting for this moment. "I've been watching you for a while, you know. I think you've noticed." The weight of his words hit me like a ton of bricks. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. "Watching me?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his eyes still fixed on mine. "I've been watching and waiting. I think it's time you knew the truth." His words echoed in the confined space of the elevator, the cold metal walls seeming to close in around me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I instinctively tried to move toward the corner, as though putting distance between us could somehow keep me safe. "Truth," I choked out. "What truth?" Mr. Harrison took a step closer, his eyes never leaving mine. He was so calm, so composed, that it unnerved me even more. "Do you think you're the only one who's noticed the changes? The subtle shifts in the building? In me?" His voice was quiet, almost a murmur, but each word seemed to carry a weight far beyond the elevator's small space. "You've felt it, haven't you? The tension, the change. We're not so different, you and I." I felt a shiver run down my spine, and though I couldn't understand what he meant, the implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My mind raced, trying to make sense of his words. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice shaking. But I refused to let fear take over. His smile, when it came, was not comforting in the least. It was thin, almost imperceptible, and yet there was something in it that made my blood run cold. "Oh, I think you do," he replied softly. "The way you watch me from across the hall. The way you've looked at me when you thought I wasn't paying attention." His words hit me like a slap to the face. I hadn't been watching him. I had barely given him a second thought. But somehow, he had twisted my every glance into something sinister. I could feel the tension building in my chest, and my throat constricted, making it hard to breathe. "You've been watching me?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Not just watching," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Learning, waiting, observing. I needed to see how you'd react when the time came. To see how long it would take for you to notice." The realization hit me like a thunderclap. This wasn't a random encounter. This was calculated. This was planned. I was trapped, not just in this elevator, but in a psychological web of his making. And as the minutes stretched on, I could feel the walls closing in, not just physically but mentally as well. The weight of his gaze was suffocating. He wasn't just holding me captive in this confined space. He was holding me captive in my own fear, my own uncertainty. I glanced toward the elevator buttons once more, but they remained dark, unresponsive. The world outside felt so far away, as though it no longer mattered. My focus was entirely on him, on the unsettling realization that I had no idea who this man really was. And now, it seemed like I might never know. The silence between us grew thick, heavy, almost unbearable. I could feel the beads of sweat forming on the back of my neck, the air inside the elevator suddenly feeling too warm. Mr. Harrison's eyes never left me. They were intense, unblinking, as though he were waiting for me to say something, anything, to respond to his unsettling revelation. But the words I wanted to say, words that would confront him, push him back, demand answers, seemed to freeze in my throat. Fear gripped me, and my mind raced, trying to process what was happening. He had been watching me? For how long? Why? And why, in this moment, had he decided to trap us together in this small, confined space? I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout for help, to pound on the walls and beg for the elevator to start moving again. But something in his expression told me that such actions would only make things worse. There was a quiet authority in the way he stood, the way he spoke, as though he knew exactly how to control the situation, how to break me down without lifting a finger. The longer the silence stretched, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. My breath grew shallow, and I could feel the panic rising within me, clawing at my chest. I needed to say something, to break the tension before I lost my mind. "You've been watching me," I repeated, my voice a little stronger now, though still trembling. "But for what? What do you want from me?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step toward me, and I instinctively took a step back, my heart pounding louder in my chest. He smiled, a thin, almost pitying smile. "I don't want anything from you," he said quietly, his voice like silk, smooth and unsettling. "I just wanted you to understand. To know what it feels like to be watched. To be the subject of someone else's gaze. To be the one who is noticed." His words were cryptic, and my confusion only deepened. It didn't make sense. Why would anyone want to make another person feel this way? It was a game to him, a cruel manipulation. But I couldn't figure out the rules, couldn't understand what was motivating him. "You're sick," I blurted out, my voice shaking with both anger and fear. "What kind of person does this? Why would you trap me here like this?" His expression didn't change. He simply looked at me, his gaze unwavering. "You're afraid of me, of what I might do. But it's not really me you're afraid of, is it?" I froze, the words hitting me like a blow. What did he mean? I wasn't just afraid of him, I was terrified of the unknown, the uncertainty of his intentions, the feeling that I was at the mercy of someone who had control over me, and I had no idea why. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing, trying to keep the fear at bay. He took another step forward, and this time I didn't back away. Something in me, something primal, told me that I couldn't let him have that power over me anymore. I stood my ground, though my legs felt unsteady beneath me. "Please," I said, my voice now steadier, though still strained. "Just let me out of here." Mr. Harrison tilted his head slightly, as though considering my request. But there was no urgency in his movements. No sign that he was even remotely bothered by the situation. He was calm. Too calm. And that was what terrified me most. "You think I'm doing this to hurt you," he said, his voice soft, almost like a gentle reprimand. "But I'm not. This is about understanding, about seeing things from a different perspective. We've all been locked in our own little worlds, haven't we? We live in our own silos, isolated from one another, never truly connecting. I thought maybe this would be the way to make you see me, to make you understand that we're all the same in the end." I wanted to scream again, but his words, they didn't make sense. How could this possibly be about connection? How could locking me in this elevator with him, making me feel like prey, have anything to do with connection? But as I looked at him, his expression oddly sympathetic, something shifted inside me. I was trapped, yes, but I wasn't entirely helpless. I realized then that I had a choice. I could either let him control me, let him continue to play his twisted little game, or I could find a way out. I had to take control, even if it meant confronting my own fears, even if it meant confronting him in a way I hadn't before. "You're wrong," I said, my voice stronger now, filled with more certainty. "You're not showing me anything. You're just trapping me. You're playing a game, and I'm not going to be your pawn." His eyes flickered for a moment, a slight twitch in his otherwise calm demeanor. It was the first crack in his control, and I latched onto it. I stepped closer, meeting his gaze directly. "You're not the only one who's been watching," I said, my words coming faster now. "I see you. I see the way you watch everyone. But it's not about connection, is it? It's about power. You want to feel like you control me. Like you control the situation. But I'm not afraid of you anymore. I won't let you control me." For a moment, there was silence. Mr. Harrison just stood there, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, his lips curled into a small smile. It wasn't a cruel smile, nor was it kind. It was almost appreciative. "Well done," he said, his voice almost like a whisper. "I knew you had it in you." Before I could respond, the elevator gave a sudden jolt, and the lights flickered again. The door slid open with a soft, mechanical hiss, revealing the empty lobby beyond. It was as if the elevator had come back to life, as if the tension had dissolved as quickly as it had built. Mr. Harrison stepped aside, gesturing for me to leave. I didn't hesitate. I didn't look back. I just walked out of the elevator, feeling the cool rush of air as I left that confined space behind me. As I stepped into the lobby, the weight of what had happened slowly began to sink in. I was free, but I was changed. I had faced a fear I hadn't known existed, both of the unknown and of the control others can sometimes exert over us. I had confronted it and, in doing so, had found strength I didn't know I had. In that moment, I understood something crucial. Fear can be paralyzing, and it can trap us in our own minds. But when we face that fear, when we stop letting others dictate our sense of safety and control, we take back the power. It was a lesson I would never forget. As I walked away from the elevator, I couldn't help but reflect on what I had learned. The world was full of people who tried to impose their control on others, to manipulate, to trap. But in the end, the most important thing was not letting them. The power to break free was always within me. Moral of the story. And that was the lesson. The moral, true strength comes from confronting our fears head on, refusing to let anyone else control us, and realizing that the power to break free has always been within us.